The silence that followed the click was heavy, vibrating with the kind of tension that usually preceded a corporate takeover or a street war execution. Tasha Alicia stood frozen by the door, her hand hovering just inches from the brass handle. She didn't need to turn around to know that the man she had spent 6 months healing was no longer the patient in the chair. "He's picking me up at 7, she repeated, her voice steadier than the erratic drumming of her heart. Behind her, the room went cold, a physical drop in temperature that she had only ever seen happen when Yoon-han Kim was about to dismantle a rival. For the first time in their relationship, the Ice King of the Underworld had lost his composure. The man who claimed she was merely his medical necessity was now the one secretly fighting the feelings he'd buried beneath layers of ink and ice. "You aren't going," Yoon-han said. His voice wasn't a shout, it was a blade through silk, sharp, precise, and dangerously quiet. Tasha finally turned. He was standing now, all 6 feet 2 inches of controlled intensity, the white fabric of his dress shirt stretched across shoulders that carried the weight of an empire. The golden evening light hit the sharp angles of his face, making the neck tattoos that crept toward his jawline look like shadows coming to life. "I'm off duty, Mr. Kim," Tasha said, clutching her bag. "My time after 7 belongs to me." "It belongs to the man who can keep you safe," he countered, crossing the distance with a predatory grace that made her breath catch. He stopped just within her personal space, the scent of expensive sandalwood and something metallic, gun oil, filling her senses. "And who is he?" Yoon-han's eyes, dark and boring into hers, searched for a flicker of weakness. "This man who thinks he has the right to take you away from this house?" "His name is Malik," she whispered, the name feeling like a shield she was holding up against a storm. "Cancel it," he commanded. "Tell him you can't make it. Tell him whatever you need to, but you are not leaving this room with another man waiting for you." The silence in the master suite of the Kim estate was never empty, it was a living thing, heavy with the weight of things unsaid and the rhythmic, steady pulse of a recovery that had become their shared world. For 6 months, Tasha Alicia had moved through this room with a quiet, efficient grace that masked the organized chaos of managing a man whose life was built on violence and secrecy. She was the only person allowed within the inner sanctum of his recovery, translating his curt commands into the gentle care required to heal the wounds he'd gathered in the shadows of the city. As she sat on the edge of the mahogany bed, the amber glow of the sunset caught the sharp, defined features of Yoon-han Kim's face, casting him in the light of a marble statue, beautiful, frozen, and seemingly unmoved by the pain she knew he felt. Her deep brown fingers moved with precision, carefully unwrapping the gauze from his shoulder. Every movement was a study in restraint. She had learned to read the micro-expressions that flickered across his face, the slight narrowing of his dark eyes when a touch was too deep, and the way his jaw would tighten almost imperceptibly as he fought to remain completely unmoved. Yoon-han watched her, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch, though she had become adept at hiding her reaction behind a mask of professional duty. To him, she was a beautiful and brilliant presence who had redesigned the very air of his home, challenging the coldness of his life in ways no one else dared to. There were moments, late at night when the only sound was the hum of the city, that their fingers would brush, an accidental touch that felt like a lightning strike, sending electricity racing up her arm. Their relationship existed within clearly defined parameters of service and recovery, yet the air between them was thick with everything they'd never said. She knew his preference for silence over small talk, just as he had learned to recognize the subtle difference between her professional smile and the real one she only let slip when she thought he wasn't looking. He had been in love with her since the day she refused to flinch at his world, staying by his side through every late night and every painful setback. Tasha dipped a cotton swab into the antiseptic, the sharp scent of expensive and woodsy cologne mixing with the clinical smell of the room. She was his healer, but she was also his captive audience, bound to him by a healer's debt that neither knew how to settle. As she finished the dressing and smoothed her white blouse, she felt a tremor in the foundation of their silence. The debt was growing, the feelings were burying themselves deeper, and the clock on the wall was ticking toward the one moment that would shatter the peace they had so carefully constructed. The amber light of the setting sun began to retreat, leaving the master suite in a state of gold and shadow that felt like a ticking clock. Tasha glanced at her watch, 6:42 p.m. If she didn't finish her preparations now, she would be late for her third attempt at a proper first date, the previous two having been derailed by last-minute emergencies that only she, the caregiver to Seoul's most dangerous man, could handle. She stepped into the adjoining dressing room, shedding her clinical caregiver persona like an old skin. In its place, she donned a crisp white blouse, the fabric polished and professional, yet possessing a subtle undertone that whispered she had somewhere important to be. She smoothed down the silk, checking her reflection in the darkened window. Her natural hair was gathered into an elegant, high-puff bun, and her makeup was subtle, designed to transition from the clinical silence of the Kim estate to the vibrant energy of the city. She was no longer just the woman who changed bandages, she was a woman reclaiming her time. When she stepped back into the main room to collect her bag, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Yun-han was no longer sitting. He stood by the window, all 6 feet 2 inches of controlled intensity, his black eyes tracking her every movement with a predatory grace. His immaculate white shirt was unbuttoned at the throat, revealing the subtle neck tattoos that hinted at his violent history, but his expression was as carefully neutral as a marble statue. "You're leaving," it wasn't a question. His voice cut through the quiet like a blade through silk, sharp and precise. "Yes, Mr. Kim. My shift is over," Tasha replied, her voice steadier than she felt, as she slung her bag over her shoulder. She could see the micro-expressions she had learned to decode, a slight narrowing of his eyes, and the barely there tension in his shoulders. To anyone else, he looked unmoved, but to Tasha, he looked like a man, calculating his next move. His gaze lingered on the curve of her throat exposed by the open collar of her blouse, his knuckles going white as he gripped the back of a chair. The visual shift, from the woman who belonged to his recovery to the woman who belonged to the world outside, was the catalyst that finally broke his perfected professionalism. For 18 months, he had stayed silent and kept his distance, telling himself her professionalism was proof she didn't feel the same spark. But seeing her dressed for another man, her real smile, perhaps waiting for someone who didn't know the difference, made him want to burn the entire city down. The air between them became heavy with everything they'd never said, the accidental touches of the past 6 months suddenly feeling like lightning strikes in the charged silence. The metallic click of the handgun echoed through the suite, a sharp, final sound that served as a warning to a world trying to take her away. Tasha froze, her fingers white-knuckled as she gripped the handle of the heavy oak door. The room went cold, the temperature plummeting as the carefully constructed professional relationship they had maintained for months finally buckled under the weight of his possessive silence. "Step away from the door," Tasha, Yun-han commanded. His voice was no longer that of a recovering patient, it was a sharp, precise, and carried a predatory grace of a man who ruled by fear. He moved with a controlled intensity, crossing the distance until he stood just within her personal space, close enough that she could smell the expensive and woodsy scent of his cologne. "I told you, I have a date," Tasha said, her American accent barely detectable, as she forced herself to meet his dark, boring eyes. "He's picking me up at 7, and I don't intend to make him wait a third time." Yun-han's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression she had learned to recognize as a sign that he had been caught off guard. To any other person, he would appear as carefully neutral as a marble statue, but the narrowing of his eyes betrayed a flicker of raw, territorial anger. "It's Friday evening in Seoul, and it isn't safe for you to be wandering Itaewon with a man I haven't vetted," he said, his voice taking on that edge she'd only heard him use during hostile business negotiations. He placed a hand on the doorframe just above her head, his knuckles going white with the force of his grip. "There are security risks you aren't aware of. Cancel it." "This isn't about security, and we both know it," Tasha countered, her spine straightening as she refused to shrink from the man who could buy and sell companies with a single phone call. "You don't get to dictate my personal life. I have reorganized my entire schedule around your demands for 6 months, but my time tonight belongs to me." She reached for the handle again, but his hand shot out, wrapping around her wrist. It wasn't hard enough to hurt, but it was firm enough to stop her, sending a jolt of electricity racing up her arm that she hated herself for responding to. "Don't," he whispered, the single word loaded with an emotion she couldn't decipher. "Tell him whatever you need to tell him, but you're not going to him." The Ice King looked almost desperate, vulnerable in a way she'd never imagined, his mask of authority fracturing as he realized that for once, his power couldn't compel the one thing he wanted most. Tasha looked down at the hand wrapped around her wrist, then back up at the face of the man who held the city in his grip. The touch sent a jolt of electricity racing up her arm, a sensation she had fought to suppress for months, but she refused to let her body's response dictate her dignity. She straightened her spine, meeting his dark, intense gaze with a fire of her own. She had never been one to shrink from confrontation, not even from a man who could command life and death with a single phone call. "Why, Yunhan?" she whispered, the anger in her chest mingling with a dangerous, fluttering hope she tried to bury. "Why would you possibly care if I go on a date? You are my employer, and I am your caregiver. That is the boundary we both agreed to." For a long moment, the silence between them stretched, heavy with everything they had never said, the glances that lasted a second too long and the accidental touches that had felt like lightning strikes. His thumb moved almost imperceptibly against her wrist, tracing the line of her pulse, and she knew he could feel how fast her heart was racing. Then, the mask finally shattered. The Ice King, who faced down corporate raiders and underworld rivals without blinking, looked almost desperate, vulnerable in a way she had never imagined he could be. He released her wrist, stepping back as if the physical proximity was more than he could bear. "Because I can't stand the thought of you with him," Yunhan finally said, his voice rough and raw. "Because for 6 months, I have watched you walk into this room, and I have told myself that what I feel is inappropriate, impossible, and utterly inconvenient." He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, disrupting the image of the invincible boss. "Before you arrived, I was dead inside," he confessed, the words coming out like a secret torn from his soul. "I was just the company I built and the wars I fought. But you are brilliant and beautiful, and you challenge me in ways no one else dares to." He looked at her then, his composure fracturing completely. "The idea of some man who doesn't know the difference between your professional smile and your real one taking you to dinner makes me want to burn the entire city down." Tasha stared at him, her mind reeling as the man who held all the power in their relationship admitted he had stayed silent only because he feared being predatory. He had kept his distance, convinced that her professionalism was proof she didn't feel the same. But in the gold and shadow of the room, the truth was finally laid bare. He wasn't just a billionaire or a mafia boss, he was a man who had been waiting for the chance to be seen for who he was underneath the ink and the ice. The air in the master suite remained charged, heavy with the raw vulnerability of Yunhan's confession. Tasha looked at him, seeing not the Ice King, but a man who looked as though the admission had cost him something vital. Her phone buzzed in her bag, likely Malik wondering if she was on her way, but she couldn't bring herself to check it just yet. "You're right about the power imbalance," Tasha said, her voice steadier than she felt. "You're my employer, and anything that happens between us needs to be handled carefully, ethically, and with complete transparency." She pulled out her phone and quickly typed a message to Malik, her fingers flying across the screen. "I'm so sorry, but I can't make it tonight. You deserve someone who can give you their full attention, and I'm not in a place to do that. I hope you find someone wonderful." She looked back at Yunhan, who was watching her every movement with the dark eyes that held a flicker of hope he couldn't quite suppress. "I'm canceling my date," she said firmly. "Not because you asked, and definitely not because you're my boss, but because I need to understand what the hell just happened here." Yunhan took a step toward her, but Tasha held up a hand, maintaining the distance between them. "But here's what we're going to address before this goes any further. If we're going to explore whatever this is, I can't remain as your caregiver." The declaration hung between them, as sharp as the click of his gun had been moments before. "It's not just about appearances or policy. I need to know that what we have is real and not tangled up in professional obligations." She had buried whatever she was feeling for months because she needed the work, but also because she couldn't bear the thought of misreading the situation and losing the connection they shared. If she stayed in this house, under his payroll and his protection, the lines would always be blurred by the debt of his recovery. She refused to be a protected possession, hidden behind mansion walls while she was half in love with the man who owned them. "I'm going home," she said, gathering her bag again. She needed to think clearly about what she wanted, separate from the adrenaline of this moment. She was demanding and stubborn, with very high standards, for herself and for him, and she would not settle for a love that wasn't built on equal ground. As she moved toward the door, she didn't look back, even though she knew his gaze was following her, a promise and a countdown already beginning in the heavy silence of the room. Tasha's hand was already on the heavy brass handle when his voice stopped her, not with the sharp edge of a predatory command, but with a raw vulnerability that left her defenses in shambles. "Wait," Yunhan said softly, the single word loaded with an emotion she couldn't yet name. He didn't move toward her this time. Instead, he retreated behind his mahogany desk, putting physical distance between them as if he couldn't trust himself to be near her without crossing a line. He pulled a sleek, black leather folder from the drawer and slid it across the polished surface. "I've spent 6 months watching you," he admitted, his dark eyes tracking her as she tentatively stepped back into the room. "I watched you redesign my recovery, heard you correct the surgeons on my dosage, and saw the way you look at medical journals when you think I'm sleeping. You are overqualified for this life, Tasha." Tasha opened the folder, her breath catching as she scanned the legal documents inside. It was an irrevocable trust, a generous medical school endowment in her name that would cover her education and 3 times her current salary in living expenses. It was the equalizer, a path to the autonomy and agency she had been too afraid to claim for herself. "I was going to give this to you on Monday," Yunhan said, his controlled intensity replaced by a quiet certainty. "I realized I couldn't keep working this closely with you without eventually crossing a line I couldn't uncross. I needed you to have a choice that didn't involve me, a future where you report to no one but yourself." Tasha felt something warm unfurl in her chest, the anger draining out of her, as she realized the depth of his integrity. He hadn't just been pining, he had been thinking about her career and her happiness separate from his own selfish desires. "And if I'd taken the money and dated Malik anyway?" she asked, her voice of a whisper in the amber-lit room. A flash of pain crossed his face, but he didn't look away. "Then I would have wished you happiness and quietly died inside every time I saw your name in the medical journals," he replied with a hint of that dry humor she had come to treasure. "I told you I want you to choose yourself first. Your career and your future matter more than my feelings." Tasha studied him, seeing through his defenses, to the man underneath the ink and the iron. He was offering her the one thing she wanted most, the power to meet him on equal footing. She looked down at her white blouse, then back at the folder in her hands. The power imbalance that had haunted her for 18 months was dissolving, replaced by a sense of rightness and a foundation of mutual respect. She wasn't just his caregiver anymore, she was a woman on the edge of her own destiny, and for the first time, she felt brave enough to go after what she wanted. The packing of the small apartment in Gangnam felt less like a departure and more like a momentous shift in the trajectory of Tasha's life. Boxes were stacked by the door of the Kim estate, containing the few belongings she had brought into the mansion months ago. Yunhan stood in the doorway, all 6 feet 2 inches of controlled intensity, watching her with an expression of such tenderness that it made her chest ache. The silence between them was no longer heavy with bandages and medical monitors, it was heavy with everything they'd never said and the weight of a promise. "The apartment is near the university," Tasha said, smoothing her burgundy blouse as she looked around the room one last time. "It's small, but it's mine. I start classes on Monday." She needed this distance to ensure that what she felt wasn't just proximity and late nights making her feel things that won't survive the light of day. Yunhan nodded slowly, his dark eyes tracking her every movement. "I told you I would wait forever," he said, his voice rough but certain. "But 3 months of complete professionalism is torture." "It's not just about professionalism, Yunhan," Tasha corrected firmly, meeting his gaze with the same intensity she had seen him use in the boardroom. "If we are going to do this, we do it right. 3 months. No lingering looks, no accidental touches, and no private meetings that aren't about my medical progress or your continued recovery." She needed to prove to herself, and the whispers of the world, that she was undeniably good and independent. He reached out slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away, and took her hand in his. The touch was electric, a reminder of the lightning strikes that had defined their time together. 3 months is nothing, he murmured, his thumb tracing the line of her pulse one last time. "It gives me time to plan the perfect first date." It better be good, she said, allowing herself a secret smile. I have very high expectations. I'm aware, he replied, and for the first time since she had known him, Yunhan gave her a real genuine smile that transformed his entire face. As she gathered her final bag and walked toward the elevator, she heard him call her name, not the formal address he always used, but simply Tasha. She turned, one hand on the button. I'll see you on the other side of 90 days, he said, standing like a figure from a painting in the doorway. Tasha didn't move for a long moment, her heart pounding as the doors slid shut, separating their worlds so that they could eventually build a new one from scratch. The first month was a torture of discipline that tested the very foundation of their agreement. Tasha spent her nights in her small apartment in Gangnam, drinking too much coffee and making lists of medical terminology that sometimes blurred into a meaningless pros and cons about the life she had left behind. She had taken the position of a medical student with the same dedicated practice she had once given to Yunhan's recovery, throwing herself into the challenging, frustrating, and inexplicably thrilling experience of her new studies. On Sunday mornings, she went for a long run along the Han River, watching families enjoy the late autumn sunshine while she waited for a countdown only 2 people in the city truly understood. She was done hiding parts of herself to fit into the mansion, yet the silence of her new independence felt like a whirlwind of pining. Across the city, the Kim estate felt like a marble statue of its former self, cold and unnervingly quiet. Yunhan was always first in, last out, a workaholic who treated the company and his underworld empire like his living, breathing child to distract himself from the void Tasha had left. He spent his late nights in his corner office, staring out at the Seoul skyline, with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, the dark circles under his eyes, suggesting his nights were as sleepless as her own. He kept his word with a quiet certainty, maintaining a complete professionalism that was inappropriate at best to his true desires, yet vital to the integrity he wanted to prove to her. They saw each other only once every 4 weeks for formal medical follow-ups, meetings that were handled with a complete transparency and always included at least one other staff member to give the gossip mill nothing to work with. During these sessions, there were strictly no lingering looks and no accidental touches. Tasha remained firmly professional, needing to establish her credibility and prove her competence even as her heart stuttered every time their eyes met. She needed to be so undeniably good at her new path that the whispers of her past as a Mafia boss's caregiver wouldn't matter. As the 90 days dwindled, the adrenaline of the moment from that Friday night faded, replaced by something real and not tangled up in professional obligations. They were both standing on the edge of something momentous, proving to themselves that their connection wasn't just a byproduct of proximity and late nights, making them feel things that won't survive the light of day. By the final week of the 3rd month, the secret smile playing at Tasha's lips was no longer a defense, it was a promise and a countdown to the moment they could finally step out of the shadows. The winter chill of Seoul bit at the air, but inside Tasha's small apartment, the warmth of anticipation made the space feel expansive. She dressed with extra care, choosing a tailored suit that made her feel powerful and confident. Her curls were styled in a way that was distinctly her own. She was finally done hiding parts of herself to fit into spaces that hadn't been designed for her. Tonight, she wasn't the caregiver in a white blouse or a student buried in textbooks, she was the woman who had earned it based solely on her merit and her own stubborn, high standards. When the knock came at exactly 7, her heart stuttered in a way that had nothing to do with medical vitals. She opened the door to find Yunhan Kim standing in the hallway, looking like a figure from a painting. He was all 6 feet 2 inches of controlled intensity, but the professional mask he usually wore was nowhere to be found. For the first time, he didn't look like a boss or a billionaire who could have anyone. He looked like a man who had waited forever for the chance to be seen for who he was underneath the ink and the power. "You're early," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I've been counting the minutes for 3 months, Tasha," he replied, and for the first time since she'd known him, he gave her a real genuine smile that transformed his entire face. He didn't reach for her with a predatory grace, instead, he stood his ground, waiting for her to choose him. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, elegantly wrapped gift, not jewelry or corporate bribes, but a vintage fountain pen engraved with her name and her future title as a doctor. To the woman who redesigns every approach she touches, he said, his dark eyes remaining warm. Tasha felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This was how it was supposed to be, two equals building something together with respect and integrity as their foundation. The attraction was undeniable and electric, but it was tempered by genuine admiration. I have very high expectations for this dinner, Mr. Kim, she teased, stepping out and locking her door, a boundary she was finally ready to let him cross. I've spent months learning exactly what you like, he whispered, offering his arm as they moved toward the elevator. I'm ready. As the doors slid open, Tasha knew that whatever decision she made tonight would change the trajectory of her entire life. Their love had survived the light of day, and as they stepped out into the shades of gold cast by the city lights, she knew it could survive anything.